You take a ruler and ask a friend of yours to lift this ruler up high, and the game is that he will release it at some point. But the rule is, you must close your hand in a way that you can catch the ruler before it falls to the ground. And besides, you will not know when that ruler will be released with any kind of signal. You have probably played this game at some point, and it is a very simple test of reaction time. Generally, the closer to the bottom of the ruler you catch it, the shorter your reaction time is. But even though it's simple, this game shows us something interesting. There is an interval in which the information of the ruler being released travels to your brain, is processed, and then information to react travels to your hands to catch the ruler. And this whole process involved various different cells ranging from those in your eyes to your brain, and even to the muscles in your arms. What I'm trying to say is that no matter how fast it is not something instantaneous. And I know that for many watching this video, this seems extremely obvious. It shouldn't even need to be pointed out. But I want to try to convince you that questioning whether something is instantaneous or not is a much deeper question than it seems. And I will start by asking you to think of an apple. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to draw an apple. You don't need to write. Just think of an apple. To do this, your eyes or your ears received this request, and the information traveled again to your brain. So I ask the following question. How long did it take for your brain to create the thought of an apple? But we can go a bit deeper into this. When you are really alone, just you and your thoughts, how long does it take for each thought to form in your head? In these two examples, it is much more difficult to determine if thought is instantaneous or not. So, if thought is not instantaneous, it is something extremely fast. But how fast? Is it like the speed of light, or a percentage of the speed of light? What is the speed of a thought?
Hey, Pedro here. This video you are watching was originally in Portuguese, my native language. This is the attempt of our team to translate it to English, and I sincerely hope you enjoy it. Your feedback is extremely important to us. Now, back to the video.
Surprisingly, this question is not new. Understanding how information travels in a living being is so complex that the search for answers has been going on for almost 2 centuries. Historically, the first studies that attempted to quantify the speed of information in living beings took place at a time when the very way information is passed in society was changing. We could even say that one was inspired by the other. In 1844, the physicist Samuel Morse introduced the commercial telegraph using wires. It was the first time that a message could be passed quickly between 2 people in 2 different places. And I don't even need to say that this was the point where our idea of the speed of information changed. A response which used to be sent by letter and could take days, weeks, or even months was now just a few minutes away. Today, messages are even faster and technology advances in this direction every day, enabling the rapid exchange of audio, images, and even videos. You can communicate almost instantly even with an astronaut on the ISS. But the point is that, for the time, even being minutes, it was already enough to change the perspective on the speed of information. And it didn't take long for the question to turn to ourselves. How fast is a thought? In that same decade, the German physiologist Hermann von Helmholtz conducted experiments precisely to calculate the speed of this process. Helmholtz conducted reaction experiments on both animals and humans. In one of the experiments, he gave small shocks to different parts of a person's body and asked them to indicate when they felt it. And from this experiment, he concluded that the distance to the brain affected the reaction time. In other words, if the shock was given to the foot, it would have a different time than if it was given to the spine or the arms. In fact, he was one of the first to reach this conclusion. Helmholtz's experiments and telegraphs had in common the advancement of science and technology at the time, more specifically electromagnetism. It was precisely during this time that names like Faraday and Maxwell contributed to the advancement of electromagnetism, which enabled the progress of technology. And it was precisely with the use of the telegraph and electromagnetism that scientists began to get an idea of how a neuron might work. After all, we are talking about a time when there was nothing wireless. Everything depended on wires. And the idea of neurons was precisely something similar to a wire that transmitted information. Moreover, both use electrical impulses to pass information forward. Of course, each in a different way. This further propelled the quest to calculate the speed of information being transmitted in the hardware of the human body, which are the neurons. But the answer was not as expected. Each researcher arrived at a different result, sometimes even with similar experiments. And that's because the matter is much more complex than it seems. What they and various researchers over time have realized is that reaction time varies due to several factors. Age is an important factor. Children and young people in general seem to have faster processing. Another factor is the body's own temperature, which can interfere with how information is propagated. Neurological diseases and some traumas can also interfere. Some researchers suggest that psychological factors such as depression can also be variables that change from person to person, not to mention evolutionary factors. There are situations where we need to react so quickly and put ourselves in a state of alert so fast that it seems like our brain has been tuned to react better. This even leads us to the point that we do not have just one type of neuron. Each one has a different function and may have a different transmission speed, and the properties that each neuron has also need to be taken into consideration. For example, the existence of a protein coat or the thickness of a neuron. And here I started throwing the term neuron around, but I think it's important for us to take a step back and understand why neurons are the protagonists of today's video. If we consider that the process of a thought is like computer software, then neurons are the hardware that make it possible. Neurons are the key components that allow information to be transmitted from different parts of our body to the brain and vice versa. They are cells that have three main components, which are the dendrites, soma or cell body, and the axon. But besides these three, there are other structures, such as the axonal cone and the axonal terminal. But let's focus on the three. The signal that will be transmitted starts in the dendrites, passes through the soma, and travels along the axon. There are properties in neurons that prevent the signal from being passed in the reverse direction. Neurons vary in size and thickness depending on the function they perform, the location they are in, and even varying from person to person. And interestingly indeed, much like conductive wires, the wider a neuron or a wire is, the faster and more signals and information are transmitted. The thicker a neuron is, the more information can be transmitted, and this also affects the duration of the transmission. And an interesting fact is that if all the neurons in the brain were the size of the largest neuron we have, the brain would be so big that we wouldn't be able to fit through doors. There are different types of neurons, but in a very general way, they can be divided into three classes. Sensory neurons, as the name suggests, are involved in transmitting what happens inside and outside the body. Motor neurons are associated with commands for the muscles, organs, and glands. And the interneurons handle the communication between sensory and motor neurons. But I am speaking in very general terms. It is important to keep in mind that when we talk about the human body and especially neuroscience, things are always more complex. But for the purpose of this video, to answer the question of what the speed of thought is, these general definitions will already serve us. Now we have an idea of how the hardware works. So how does the software work? In a very simplified manner, dendrites receive signals, the signals are processed, and they are passed along by the axon. But all of this involves many phenomena that even use quantum physics along the way. So let's take it easy. The dendrites are responsible for receiving signals that can be excitatory or inhibitory. Excitatory signals can make the neuron fire or generate an electrical impulse, while inhibitory signals prevent the neuron from firing. As a single neuron can receive multiple signals at the same time, what determines whether a signal will be fired or not is the sum of all the signals, both excitatory and inhibitory. If the sum tends towards the excitation of a nerve impulse, we call it an action potential, which will be propagated throughout the neuron via the axon. The mechanism that makes this electrical impulse pass is the potential difference between the inside of the neuron and the outside. The electrical signal propagates when an exchange occurs between the internal and external environment, based on the potential. And this is done through specific proteins that open up, allowing this exchange. You have probably seen or even done that experiment with the Daniell cell where this ion exchange occurs. Here we are talking about a similar phenomenon, but the exchange is defined by a biological process. When this potential difference is above a certain value, it creates this action potential that will send the information forward. In some cases, the difference in potential is not that significant, so it doesn't pass a signal forward, or it does, but it becomes weaker, which is called a graded potential. And after the signal passes, the channel returns to its original polarization and enters a refractory period linked to the inactivation of the channels. This inactivation prevents the electrical signal from going back to its origin. This forces it in only one direction. It will reach the end of the axon and will need to pass to another neuron, and here a second information process comes into play. When the electrical signal reaches the end of the axon, it releases neurotransmitters through chemical processes. And these neurotransmitters will be received by other neurons that will continue the process of passing information until it reaches your brain or the part of your body. It is important to just note that there is another type of structure in the nervous system, called glia. Glia has various functions. Some of them include helping with the structure of neurons, controlling the ion difference in the environment of neurons, and some even suggest that certain types may participate in the process. The speed of this entire process varies with the type of neuron and also with those other factors that I mentioned earlier. Some can transmit at speeds of up to 120 meters per second, while others transmit at less than 2 meters per second. It is difficult to give a precise answer because the nervous system is so complex that it often involves the transmission of 2 or more types of neurons, but an average speed for a neuron is about 40 or 50 meters per second. Okay, that is extremely fast, but it still doesn't come close to the speed at which electric fields and electrons propagate in conductive wires. So, is it possible to speed up a neuron? To make this transmission even faster? And the answer is yes, through a substance called myelin. This substance can be present surrounding the axon and serving as a kind of insulating tape that prevents signal loss. There is something that, in fact, we need to insert into the conductors. We need the insulator so it doesn't lose electrons to the environment. Myelin plays this role for the neurons, so it helps maintain the signal and we don't lose the information being transmitted. But that's not all myelin does. It also speeds up the transmission through a phenomenon called saltatory conduction. Basically, the axon is not completely covered with myelin. There are some gaps where there is no covering, and these gaps are called nodes of Ranvier. The nodes of Ranvier allow the signal to jump from one node to another without the need to travel the entire length of the axon. Imagine that these nodules function as a kind of shortcut that shortens the journey the signal has to make, which in turn speeds up the whole process. And furthermore, the larger the diameter of the axon, the less resistance the signal encounters during its passage. Combining these two properties, some neurons can reach 3 times above the common average speed. And now that I have explained how the cells that make up our nervous system work and how they transmit information, we can return to the question from the video. What is the speed of a thought? We have the speed at which neurons transmit, and we can calculate the reaction time. So, this can't be that difficult to answer. But we are talking about a network composed of 86 billion neurons that are spread throughout the human body. Some are relatively simple, like the neurons involved in the patellar reflex. You just need to use simple instruments that even you can calculate. But when we go to the brain, the story changes completely. We are talking about an extremely complex system. And when I say extremely complex, it's not just a figure of speech. Look at a type of neuron found in a part of the brain called the cerebellum. Notice the number of branches, each receiving information from countless other neurons, each of which also has its own branches. But we can't even say exactly how many neurons are involved in a thought, because it can involve different regions of the brain, and especially how many types of neurons are involved in the process. It is not a simple question with a straightforward answer. Many factors affect it, such as age or the presence of some disorder, temperature, and even the environment. And when I talk about environment, I am also referring to our own individual experiences. Because if I already know something, the thought will probably come to me faster than to someone who is seeing and learning it for the first time. What I am trying to say is, we basically cannot know the speed of a thought. We can only know that it is not instantaneous and is much slower than the speed of light or the speed at which electrons move. You can also consider the average propagation speed of a neuron, which is something that can give us an idea. We can only conclude that it is undoubtedly a very fast speed, even for our survival. Neuroscience is a very broad field with many questions that are still being answered. After all, studying one of the most complicated pieces of hardware known is a challenge. There are ongoing studies that try to understand how the brain reacts to stimuli and perhaps in this way manage to answer questions about thought. We still have a long way to go to fully understand how the brain works and how thoughts are generated. After all, our consciousness is still one of humanity's great open questions, but that will have to wait for another video. Thank you very much and see you next time.